She had packed it herself. That was the detail I couldn't let go of afterward, the small backpack with the broken zipper pull, the one shaped like a strawberry, sitting just inside the front door of my parents' house like she had been ready to leave for a very long time. My name is Nina. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a pediatric social worker, which means I have spent the better part of a decade learning to recognize the signs that a child is not okay. I have sat across from teachers, coaches, school nurses, and frightened parents, and I have learned to read the specific language of children who are not being cared for, the way they hold themselves in chairs, the way they answer simple questions with an alertness that doesn't belong at their age, the way they are always slightly too ready to leave wherever they are. I had been reading those signs in my niece Zoe for 3 years. I had been telling myself I was overreacting for almost as long. Zoe was 8 years old, dark-haired, thin-wristed, with eyes that were too watchful for a child who had grown up in a house full of adults who were supposed to adore her. She was my brother Damon's daughter. Damon was 38, currently living in Phoenix with a woman named Britta and a job in logistics that kept him conveniently unavailable for most of the year. Zoe's mother, a woman named Renata, had left when Zoe was 3, not disappeared, not abandoned in any dramatic sense, just quietly removed herself to a life in another state with another man, in the way that some people exit the way they came in, gradually, then all at once. There had been a custody arrangement that gave my parents temporary guardianship. Temporary had stretched across 5 years without anyone formally revisiting it, which was the first thing I should have pushed harder on, and didn't. My parents, Gerald and Paulette, lived in a square beige house on Callaway Street in Morrow Falls, Indiana, in a neighborhood of square beige houses where everyone knew everyone's business with the selective accuracy of people who decide what to know and what to overlook. My father was 67, retired from the water treatment plant, a man whose emotional range in daily life had always occupied a narrow band between mild satisfaction and mild irritation. My mother was 64, worked 3 mornings a week at an insurance office downtown, and was the kind of woman who considered any conversation about feelings to be a form of complaint. They had raised Damon and me with a particular philosophy, not cruel, exactly, but efficient. You ate what was on your plate. You didn't perform for sympathy. You didn't make things harder than they needed to be. When I became a social worker at 25, my mother told her friends I worked with kids, the way you describe someone who taught swimming lessons, and we never discussed the specifics. I had been watching Zoe for 3 years by the time I found the backpack. And I had spent most of those 3 years being told, in various registers of patient disappointment, that I was dramatic. The first time I raised it directly was a Sunday dinner in October, 2 years prior. Zoe had sat through the entire meal without speaking, not shy quiet, not tired quiet, but the vigilant quiet of a child who has learned that drawing attention to herself produces unpredictable results. She ate carefully, cut her food into small pieces the way an adult would, asked to be excused in a formal little voice, and then disappeared to the back bedroom and didn't come out. She seems withdrawn, I said, after I heard the bedroom door close. My mother was clearing plates. She didn't look up. She's always been quiet. This is different from quiet, I said. My father lowered his newspaper. He still read an actual newspaper, which I had always found both quaint and effective as a method of signaling that a conversation was not worth his full attention. He looked at me over the top of it. You see problems everywhere, he said. It's your job. You bring it home. I'm not bringing anything home. I'm watching my niece sit through dinner without making a single sound and then leave the table like she was released. My mother set a stack of plates in the sink with a ceramic clatter. She's fine, Nina. You analyze everything. I drove home that night watching the flat Indiana highway unspool in my headlights and felt something tight and unresolved sitting in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to the beginning of understanding that I was going to have to fight for something, and that the fighting was going to be lonely, and that the people I'd need to fight against were the people who had taught me what the word family meant. That was the first red flag I named and then set back down. Looking back now, the fact that they had an answer ready, you analyze everything, should have told me that this wasn't the first time they'd prepared for that conversation. But I wasn't ready to understand that yet. I worked out of the Morro Falls Department of Child Services, in an office that smelled permanently of institutional coffee and printer toner. My caseload averaged between 14 and 18 families at any given time. I had a supervisor named Marcus who had been doing this work for 22 years and had the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from the job itself but from the accumulated weight of being right about things before anyone in authority is willing to act on them. I was good at my work. I am not saying this as self-congratulation, I am saying it because it became, eventually, the central painful irony of the situation. I was trained to recognize what I was seeing. I had the vocabulary, the frameworks, the professional experience. And I spent 3 years convincing myself that the rules of my work did not apply to my own family. That professional knowledge somehow stops at the front door of the house you grew up in. Denial isn't ignorance. It's a choice. Not always a conscious one, but a choice nonetheless. You choose it because the alternative requires you to name something that cannot be unnamed, and naming it changes everything that comes after. I understood that in the abstract for years before I understood it about myself. Zoe went to Callaway Elementary, 4 blocks from my parents' house. I knew her teacher by name, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, 2nd grade, the kind of teacher who writes encouraging notes on homework in colored pen and remembers which students prefer to be called by nicknames. I had run into Mrs. Aldrich once at the pharmacy, and she had paused just a half-second too long before saying that Zoe was doing fine, adjusting well, and in that half-second I felt something register in me like a frequency I couldn't quite tune. I didn't follow up. I told myself I was reading too much into a pause. That's the thing about knowing what to look for, it doesn't protect you from choosing not to look. The Sunday dinners continued, one every few weeks, and Zoe was always there in the same way, present but contained, polite in a manner that had none of the child's usual formlessness to it. She didn't ask for things. She didn't complain. She said please and thank you without being prompted, and she ate whatever was in front of her without comment. She was 8 years old and she had already learned to take up as little space as possible. End of part 1. Somewhere in my parents' house, a strawberry backpack sat by the front door. It had been sitting there, I would later learn, for 4 days. Morro Falls in November is the color of wet cardboard, low sky, bare trees, the kind of flat gray light that makes everything look slightly less than it was in summer. I drove the same route to work every morning, Elm to Harrison to the bridge over the Morro River, where in cold weather a mist sat on the water until mid-morning. I had lived in this city my whole life except for 4 years of college in Indianapolis, and there was a particular relationship I had with its geography, intimate, slightly suffocating, the way you know a place when you've watched it your whole life but have never been able to entirely decide if you love it. My apartment was a second-floor unit above a dry cleaner on Mercer Street, not glamorous, but mine. I had painted the kitchen yellow the first week I moved in, which my mother had called impractical. A small act of self-determination, though I didn't frame it that way at the time. I had a cat named Gordon who ignored me with magnificent consistency and a bookshelf that had long since exceeded its structural mandate. Work was steady. A case involving a 7-year-old whose school attendance had dropped to 40%. A family in transition after a domestic violence removal. A teenage mother navigating a reunification process with her infant. These were the textures of my days, serious, often painful, and paradoxically clarifying. In my work I was certain of very little, but I was certain that children reveal what adults conceal, and that the gap between what a child's behavior communicates and what the adults around them acknowledge is almost always where the truth lives. I thought about Zoe during those days more than I was willing to admit to anyone. I called Damon in early November. He answered on the 4th ring, which was typical, and I heard the ambient noise of an open space behind him, a warehouse, probably, or a distribution center. "Hey," he said. "What's up?" "I wanted to check in about Zoe," I said. "She's good. Mom and Dad have it handled." "When did you last see her?" A pause. July, I think. Maybe June. June or July. It was November. Damon. Nina, don't. His voice was even, preemptive. I know what you're going to say. You've been saying it for 2 years. They're not perfect, but they're not neglecting her. She has a roof, food, school. A roof and food is the legal minimum, I said. That's not the same as being cared for. You always do this, he said. You turn everything into a case file. I held the phone against my ear and looked out my kitchen window at the November street below, a woman walking a dog, a man in a yellow vest loading packages from a van. She packed a bag, Damon. Mom mentioned it last week, like it was nothing. An 8-year-old packed a bag and put it by the front door. Kids do weird things. Kids don't pack bags and put them by the front door unless they're trying to communicate something. He told me he'd check in with Mom. He didn't call back. That silence, the comfortable silence of a man who had been practicing it for years, told me more than any conversation we'd had. The thing I hadn't fully let myself see yet was that Damon's distance wasn't just conflict avoidance. He was managing something. The not seeing was deliberate in a way that was different from my parents' defensiveness. He had built a life in Phoenix precisely calibrated to the distance required to remain uninvolved. And that had its own kind of cruelty, the cruelty of a parent who is technically reachable and practically absent. I started keeping notes. Not officially, not a case file, because Zoe was my family and the paperwork would have required me to navigate conflicts of interest that I wasn't ready to navigate. Just a small green notebook that I kept in my desk drawer at home. Dates, observations, things I'd noticed. November 4th, Zoe at dinner, didn't speak for 90 minutes. Wearing a sweater with a hole at the elbow, same one she had on 3 weeks ago. Asked if she could call me and Mom said she'd think about it. November 11th, called Mom to ask about Zoe's winter coat. Mom said she has one. Didn't describe it. November 18th, drove past school pickup. Zoe was last child standing, waited 25 minutes after dismissal. My mother arrived in the car without getting out. Zoe opened the back door herself and got in. Each entry was small. Each entry was, technically, explainable. Busy grandparents. A child who was naturally introverted. Financial limitations. Family patterns that looked different from outside. But there was a cumulative picture building in that green notebook, and I was the only person in my family who was writing it down. I hadn't told anyone about the notebook. Not my colleague Britt, not my supervisor Marcus, not my friend Carla, who had known my family for over 20 years, lived 2 streets from my parents, and who I trusted with most things. I would later understand why I hadn't told Carla. Some part of me already knew, without fully knowing, that Carla was not a safe place for this particular truth. The second clear red flag came at Thanksgiving. My parents hosted, as they always did. The table was the same table it had always been, the dark walnut one with the scratch along one side from a move 20 years ago, the one my mother covered with a cloth she only brought out twice a year. My Aunt Helen was there with her husband Ray. Carla came, as she usually did for holidays, bringing a sweet potato casserole with the marshmallows slightly too browned. Damon was not there. He sent a text the morning of the holiday, something about flights, and my mother relayed this to the table with a tone that communicated acceptance without complaint, which was her highest form of generosity. Zoe sat at the corner of the table in a chair that was slightly too tall for her, her feet not quite reaching the floor, eating with the careful economy I had come to recognize as her baseline. She had a small bruise on her left forearm, faded yellow-green at the edges, the age of it suggesting it was at least a week old, maybe more. Not large. Not shaped like anything identifiable. I mentioned it quietly to my mother while we were in the kitchen. She fell, my mother said, without turning from the counter. She's always falling. She's clumsy. There it was again, the answer arriving too quickly, too complete, as if she'd been carrying it in her pocket. I didn't push. I should have. But the table was full of people eating turkey and I was 33 years old and she was still my mother and the specific weight of that relationship, all 33 years of it, pressed down on my capacity to insist. That moment in the kitchen sits in my memory differently now. Not because the bruise was definitive, it wasn't. But because of the way my mother didn't look at me when she answered. She knew I was watching her face for something. And she made sure I couldn't see it. December moved with the particular slowness of a month that has too much packed into it. My caseload was heavy. The holidays always made things worse, the pressure of performance, the closed doors, the children who arrived back at school in January with things that had happened over break written into their bodies in ways that words hadn't caught up to yet. I visited my parents twice in December. The first time, Zoe was in the back bedroom with the door closed when I arrived, and she didn't come out until called for dinner. She had drawn something on a piece of paper that was lying on the table, a house with very small figures outside it, the kind of drawing that wouldn't mean anything to anyone who wasn't paying attention. I folded it very carefully and put it in my coat pocket when no one was looking. At home that night I unfolded it on my kitchen table and looked at it under the lamp. 2 large figures, 1 small one. The small one was positioned apart from the 2 large ones, not dramatically, not with any obvious distress signal, just slightly outside the frame of where the other figures stood. The house behind them had its door drawn shut. Children draw what they know. They don't editorialize. They don't exaggerate for effect. That image, the small figure at the edge, the closed door, stayed with me in the way that specific images sometimes do, embedding in somewhere deeper than conscious thought. I took a photograph of the drawing on my phone and put the original back in my coat pocket. Then I sat at my kitchen table and thought about the green notebook in my desk drawer and the growing distance between what I was observing and what I was willing to call it. The second December visit was the day I met Zoe's teacher. Not by accident. I had called Mrs. Aldrich the week before, carefully, as an aunt, not as a social worker, making the distinction explicit, and asked if she had 5 minutes. She met me after school in her empty classroom, which had paper snowflakes hanging from the ceiling tiles and a reading corner with a beanbag chair in the shape of a frog. She offered me coffee from a small machine on her desk and gave me a cup that said "World's Okayest Teacher" in chipped lettering. She was careful with her words. Measured. But she didn't need to say much. Zoe is a bright child, she said. Very self-contained. Very eager to please the adults in the room. Too eager? I asked. She looked at her coffee cup. I've noticed she doesn't ask for help. Even when she needs it. She'd rather sit with a problem she can't solve than raise her hand. She paused. She told me once that she didn't want to bother anyone. 8 years old. Didn't want to bother anyone. Has she said anything about home? I asked. Another careful pause. She talks about you, Mrs. Aldrich said. Her aunt. She says you have a yellow kitchen. A small, complicated smile. She mentions it like it's a place she'd like to be. I drove home from that school with both hands on the wheel and something cold and certain settling into place inside me. The kind of certainty you resist because of what it will require you to do. I hadn't fully accepted it yet. But I was getting there. Carla called me that week, not unusually, we spoke regularly, and in the course of a conversation about nothing in particular she mentioned she'd stopped by my parents that afternoon. Said she'd had coffee with my mother. Said Zoe had been there, doing homework at the kitchen table, and that she seemed fine, seemed good. Was she? I said. Oh, you know how she is. Quiet. She's always been quiet. A beat. Your mom was saying you've been asking a lot of questions lately. She's worried about you. The sentence landed differently than it was probably meant to. She's worried about you. Not worried about Zoe. Worried about me. Concerned about my questions rather than curious about what had prompted them. I said something non-committal and got off the phone and sat with the particular feeling of realizing that a triangulation had been happening around me, that my mother had been managing the narrative, and that Carla, probably without entirely understanding what she was doing, had been part of the management. I thought about who I had talked to about my concerns over the past 2 years. My brother, who had deflected. My parents, who had defended. Carla, who had listened and then, I now understood, reported back. I had been ventilating into a closed system. Zoe had a birthday in January. She would turn 9. I asked my mother what she wanted. She hasn't said, my mother said. Can I ask her? You can ask her when you see her. Can I take her out? Just the two of us? Get her something she picks herself? A pause that went on slightly too long. She has school. It would be on a Saturday. We'll see, my mother said. We see was the answer she gave to things she intended to decline without having to say no. I had grown up inside that language. I understood exactly what it meant. That night I opened the green notebook and I wrote, "She doesn't let me have time alone with Zoe." 3 times in the last year I've asked. 3 times, we'll see. This is deliberate. It was the first time I had written anything in the notebook that used the word deliberate. Some part of me understood, writing it, that I had passed a line I couldn't uncross. January arrived with the particular bleakness of a Midwestern winter that has dropped any remaining pretense of being temporary. The Mora River was iced at the edges. The drive to work was gray and thin-lit, and the mornings were the kind of cold that made the world feel smaller, compressed, like everything had pulled inward to conserve warmth. I made a decision. Not about filing anything, not yet. But about asking the right person the right question in the right way. I called Marcus. I didn't frame it as my family. I said I wanted to talk through a hypothetical, a child, 8 years old, in the care of grandparents under an informal arrangement, presenting with specific behavioral patterns, a teacher's observations, limited access to extended family. I laid it out precisely, in the clinical language we used at work, and I listened to Marcus listen. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been going on?" he said. "The arrangement?" 5 years. "The observations?" 3 years. Another pause. "Nina," he said carefully. "Is this a hypothetical?" I didn't answer immediately. "I need to know what the threshold looks like," I said. "Officially." He told me. He was thorough. He didn't push me for confirmation of what we both understood, and he didn't offer me the comfort of telling me I was probably overreacting. Marcus had 22 years of this work. He knew the difference between professional overcaution and professional abdication. He knew which side of that line I was sitting on. I thanked him and sat at my desk for a long time after, looking at the winter light coming through the window, gray and flat and completely indifferent. I wasn't quite at the threshold. I needed more. And needing more meant I had to get closer, which meant I had to be in my parents' house with my eyes open in a way I had been carefully not being for 3 years. I invited myself to dinner in late January. Brought food, a baked chicken, a salad, things I'd made at home. My mother accepted this without particular warmth but without opposition. I arrived at 5 o'clock. Zoe was in her room. I asked if I could say hello and my mother said she was doing homework. I said I'd be quiet. My mother looked at me in the way she had been looking at me for months, a mix of wariness and practiced neutrality, and then went back to the kitchen without saying anything else. I knocked on the door of the back bedroom. It was the room that had been Damon's before he left for college, still had the same furniture, a twin bed with a dark blue comforter, a small desk, a dresser with the second drawer that had always stuck. Zoe was at the desk with a worksheet in front of her, but she wasn't writing. She was sitting very still, looking at the wall. She turned when I came in and her face did something I had been watching it do for 3 years, that rapid readjustment, that shift from whatever she'd been feeling to the version of herself she'd decided it was safe to show. Hi, Auntie Nina. Hey, Zoe. I sat on the edge of the bed. How's the homework? Almost done. She hadn't touched her pencil since I walked in. I looked around the room. The dresser had nothing on top of it except a small alarm clock, digital, the numbers casting a faint red light. No books except for a single school reader on the desk. No drawings on the wall. No stuffed animals except for one, a small gray rabbit with one ear slightly longer than the other, sitting at the corner of the bed with the particular dignity of a beloved object. The room had the quality of a place that was being lived in carefully. As if she understood that too much presence was a liability. Whose rabbit? I said. His name is Biscuit, she said. You gave him to me. I had. 3 birthdays ago. She had kept him. I looked at her, the careful posture, the alert eyes, the hands folded precisely on the desk, and I felt something I recognized from my work but had been refusing to feel here. The specific grief of a child who has adapted to an environment rather than been nurtured by it. Zoe, I said quietly. Are you okay? She looked at me for a long moment. Not the practiced adult look, something more unguarded. Something that considered the question as if she'd been waiting for it. I packed my bag, she said. Did you see it? I saw it, I said. I put it there so I'd be ready, she said. In case. In case of what? She picked up her pencil. Looked at the worksheet. In case someone came. Even now, hearing it again in memory, something in my chest contracts. She had packed a bag and put it by the door and been waiting. For how long, she didn't say. Long enough that it had become a fact of her life, a small act of hope maintained in the most practical way an 8-year-old knows how. I didn't let myself cry in front of her. But I made a decision in that bedroom, sitting on the edge of Damon's old bed with the alarm clock casting its red light on the wall, that I was done waiting for certainty. I had enough. The misdirection came from Carla. 2 days after my visit, she called me. Her voice had the careful warmth of someone who was about to say something they'd been asked to say. Your mom mentioned you've been pretty intense with Zoe lately, she said. Asking her questions, going to her room. She's worried it's confusing for her. Confused how? I said. You know, you're not her primary caregiver. Kids can get mixed signals. Or kids can get signals that someone is paying attention, I said. A pause. Nina, I've known your parents for 20 years. I've been in that house. Zoe is? I'm not asking for your assessment of my parents, I said. I'm telling you what I've observed. Silence. Then, very quietly, are you going to report them? There it was. The question that told me Carla had known this conversation was coming, had been prepared for it, had perhaps been sent to preempt it. I'm going to do my job, I said. I hung up. I opened my laptop. I started writing the formal documentation I should have started a year ago. I filed the report on a Friday morning in February, from my office at Child Services, sitting at my own desk with Marcus standing in my doorway because I had told him what I was about to do. I documented everything in the green notebook. I attached Mrs. Aldrich's informal comments, which she had agreed to formalize in writing after I called her the previous afternoon. I attached the photograph of Zoe's drawing. I documented Damon's absence, the informal guardianship arrangement, the 3 years of behavioral observations, the backpack. It took 2.5 hours to write it properly. When I submitted it, Marcus nodded once from the doorway and said nothing. Some acknowledgements don't require words. The investigation was assigned to a colleague named Priya, standard protocol, since the family was connected to me. I recused myself from the active case and handed her everything I had. Priya was thorough and unhurried and had none of the ego that sometimes made this work harder than it needed to be. My parents were notified the following Monday. My mother called me at 7:42 that evening. I let it ring. She called again at 7:55. I let it ring again. The third time, I answered. "How could you do this?" she said. It wasn't a question. The flatness in her voice was something I had never heard before, not anger exactly, but a kind of stripped-down absence of pretense that I recognized, almost with relief, as the real conversation we had never been able to have. "I did what I should have done a year ago," I said. "You've destroyed this family." Still that flat, controlled voice. "You've humiliated your father and me in front of everyone we know." "For what? Because you think we don't give Zoe enough attention?" "For what?" I said. "For a little girl who packed a bag and put it by the front door because she was waiting in case someone came for her. That's what." Silence. "She's fine," my mother said. "She's not fine," I said. "And you know she isn't. You've known for a long time." More silence. "Then, you were always dramatic." "I was always paying attention," I said. "You just didn't want me to." I heard her breathe on the other end of the line. In, out. The familiar sound of my mother composing herself. "Your father wants to know if you're coming Sunday," she said. The question was so disconnected from everything that had just been said that for a moment I simply held the phone and tried to locate myself in the conversation. "No," I said. "I'm not coming Sunday." She hung up. The investigation took 6 weeks. Priya visited the house 4 times. She spoke with Mrs. Aldrich, the school nurse, a neighbor on Callaway Street who turned out to have called a non-emergency line about Zoe the previous spring, a call that had been noted and not followed up on, which became part of the record. She spoke with Damon by phone. She spoke with Zoe, alone, in the school counselor's office, with a stuffed animal on the table between them that was not a gray rabbit named Biscuit but which Zoe held anyway throughout the interview. Damon flew in from Phoenix when the investigation became formal. He arrived at my apartment unannounced on a Wednesday evening, rang the buzzer without warning, the way he'd always operated, as if his arrival required no preparation from anyone else. I let him up. He looked tired in a way that went beyond travel. He stood in my kitchen, the yellow kitchen, and looked at the walls and said nothing for a moment. "You should have talked to me first," he said finally. "I talked to you in November," I said. "You told me to stop turning everything into a case file." "That's not," he stopped. Rubbed his face with both hands. "She's my daughter, Nina." "Yes," I said. "She is." The word landed between us the way I'd meant it to, not as an accusation, exactly, but as a fact that had weight. "She is your daughter. She has been your daughter for 8 years. And for 5 of those years you have been in Phoenix." He sat down at my kitchen table. Gordon the cat jumped up, looked at him, and walked away, which felt like appropriate commentary. "What's going to happen?" he said. "Priya will make a recommendation. The court will decide custody. You can contest or you can cooperate." I paused. "She asked about you." "Zoe. She asked if you were coming." He looked at the table. "What did you say?" "I said I thought you were." He was quiet for a long time. "I've been a coward," he said. "Not to me, exactly. More to the yellow walls, to the table, to the version of himself that had been sitting in this particular moment for years waiting for him to catch up to it." "Yeah," I said. "You have." It wasn't forgiveness. But it was honest, and there was something almost restful about that. The confrontation with my parents happened in Priya's office, not mine, standard for a case this close to home. My parents sat across a table from Priya with a family services supervisor, and I was not in the room. I heard about it afterward from Priya, in the careful, formal language of professional reporting. My mother had been composed throughout most of it. My father had said very little. When Priya presented Zoe's own statements, the things she had said in the school counselor's office, the things she said when asked what she wanted, my mother had, according to Priya, gone very still and looked at a spot on the wall for a long time. Zoe had said, among other things, that she loved her grandparents but that she felt like a guest in their house. That she tried not to make noise because loud things made her grandfather leave the room. That she had packed her bag because she hoped her aunt would come and take her somewhere with a yellow kitchen. My mother had not spoken after that for the remainder of the session. Zoe came to live with me in March. Not permanently, not yet, not legally. A supervised placement, while the formal custody process worked its way through the Morro Falls family court system. But she came with her backpack, the one with the broken strawberry zipper pull, and with Biscuit the rabbit, and with a plastic bag containing 6 smoothed stones she'd been collecting since first grade, and she stood in the doorway of my apartment and looked at the yellow kitchen and then at me. "Is this really it?" she said. "This is really it," I said. She walked in and put her bag down and looked at Gordon, who was sitting on the windowsill with the particular self-possession of a cat who has decided he approves of a situation but will not say so directly. She looked at him for a moment and then reached out one careful hand, and Gordon, who had never once in 5 years of living with me voluntarily solicited affection from a stranger, walked forward and put his head against her palm. I don't know if I've ever been more certain of anything. The legal process took 4 months. Damon returned to Phoenix and came back again, twice more, for court dates and for 2 visits with Zoe that I supervised, because the court asked me to and because I thought the contact was right even if the history was complicated. He was different in those visits than he'd been in years, quieter, more careful with his words, more willing to sit on the floor and look at Zoe's stones with the attentiveness of a man who understood he had a great deal of ground to cover and no useful shortcuts. I am not going to romanticize what Damon became. People don't transform in 4 months. But he was trying, and trying was more than he'd managed for a long time, and I was willing to leave space for what trying might eventually become. Custody was formally granted to me in July, with generous visitation rights for my parents under specific conditions, a family counselor involved, structured visits, Zoe with the right to express her preferences and have them taken seriously. My parents did not appeal. My mother called me the day after the ruling, and the conversation was the shortest we'd ever had. She said she hoped Zoe would be happy. I said I was going to do everything I could to make sure she was. We stayed on the phone for a few more seconds, both of us aware that something had been named between us that we didn't yet have new language for. "You were right," my mother said. "I wasn't expecting it. I had not been preparing for it." "I know," I said. She hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time afterward, looking at the yellow walls, listening to the ordinary sounds of Zoe doing something in the next room, the television, the quiet sound of her voice talking to Gordon the way she'd taken to doing, a running narration of his activities that he received with magnificent dignity. Carla I didn't speak to for a long time. She sent a card when Zoe moved in, a store-bought one, with a pre-printed sentiment and her name signed at the bottom. I put it in a drawer. She had not been malicious. She had been loyal to a version of my family that prioritized its own comfort over a child's welfare, and she had helped maintain that priority by relaying my concerns back to people with an interest in dismissing them. I understood her motivations. I didn't need to pretend that understanding erased the consequence. Some relationships survive a reckoning. Others reveal, in the reckoning, that they were built on a foundation that cannot hold what you now understand you need. There is no drama required to acknowledge that. You simply notice it, and you act accordingly. The school year started in September. Zoe transferred to Jefferson Elementary, which was 3 blocks from my apartment, and on the first morning she put on new sneakers she had chosen herself, orange, deliberately impractical, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror with a look of total serious concentration before pronouncing herself ready. I walked her to school. She held my hand for the first block and then let go, not because she wanted distance but because she wanted to walk beside me as an equal, which I understood and honored. At the school door she turned and looked at me with those watchful dark eyes and said, "Will you be here at 3:15? "I will absolutely be here at 3:15, I said. She went inside. I walked back through the September morning and the thought arrived quietly, without announcement, that I had spent 3 years waiting for a threshold that was always clear enough, always right in front of me, and that I had spent that time performing a version of uncertainty I didn't entirely feel. That the people who called me dramatic had counted on my reluctance to trust my own professional eyes when they were turned on people I loved. And that the moment I stopped translating what I saw into something more palatable was the moment things began to move. I had needed to stop asking for permission to trust myself. That was the lesson, and it was both simple and harder than anything I had done. Zoe has been with me for 8 months now. She has 12 stones on the windowsill, she found 6 new ones in the park behind Jefferson Elementary, and she has decided that Gordon is her cat too, which Gordon has not contested. She laughs at things the way children laugh when they've been given enough safety to stop monitoring the room first, suddenly, without preparation, from somewhere genuine. She asked me once, on a Sunday morning over pancakes, whether she was going to stay forever. I told her I was working very hard on forever. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things, and then said, "Okay. But can we get a plant? We have 4 plants now." She named them all. One of them is named Biscuit Jr., which is confusing given that Biscuit is a rabbit, but her taxonomy and I have reached an understanding. My parents come on the 3rd Sunday of each month, with the family counselor's structure in place. My mother brings food, always more than necessary, always something she knows Zoe will eat. My father sits in the corner of my living room and is quiet in his way, and sometimes Zoe goes and sits beside him with her stones and shows him things, and he looks at them with a kind of attention I don't remember him ever offering me. I watch them and feel something complicated that I am still learning to name. Not forgiveness in the full sense, not yet, maybe not ever completely. But something more spacious than anger. Something that can hold the full truth, that they failed, and that Zoe remembers them anyway, and that people can sometimes become, under pressure in consequence, slightly more than they were. I am not a simple person about this. I don't think I'm supposed to be. The strawberry backpack lives in Zoe's closet now. I washed it, fixed the zipper pull with a piece of ribbon from my sewing kit. She doesn't use it anymore, she has a new one, blue with white stars, that she's decorated with iron-on patches of birds she liked from a book. But she's kept the strawberry one. I asked her why once. She thought about it. "So I remember," she said, "that I was ready." I looked at my niece, this precise, serious, quietly resilient child, and thought about what it means to be ready. Not to leave, exactly. But to understand that you deserve to be somewhere that feels like home. That the waiting is not forever. That someone will come. Someone came. I'm glad it was me. I'm glad it wasn't too late. The yellow kitchen was always there. She just needed someone to open the door. What this story exposes, at its deepest level, is something more systemic than any single family's failure. It reveals how protective structures meant to safeguard children can be neutralized from within, not by dramatic cruelty but by the accumulated weight of social loyalty, deference to family authority, and the particular self-deception of people who equate providing the minimum with providing enough. Gerald and Paulette were not monsters. That distinction is important, and it is also precisely what made the situation so difficult to name and so prolonged in its damage. Monstrous neglect is recognizable. What they practiced was something quieter, a withdrawal of emotional investment, a running of the household according to their own rhythms and comfort, with a child tucked into the margins of it. Zoe had shelter and food and school, and she had nothing else reliably. And in a community of people who had known this family for decades, the bar of basically fine became an ethical ceiling rather than a floor. The role of social proximity in enabling neglect is what this story ultimately illuminates. Carla was not a co-conspirator in any formal sense. But her position, 20 years of friendship with Nina's parents, dinner table familiarity, easy access to both sides of the family, made her a perfect conduit for a narrative that needed maintaining. When she told Nina, "Your mother is worried about you," she was performing the function that every enabling system performs, redirecting concern away from the person who needs it and toward the person raising it. This is not evil. It is simply how communities protect themselves from the discomfort of knowing something they'd rather not act on. Damon's culpability is the thread that complicates any clean resolution. He was Zoe's father. The legal and moral weight of that word belongs to him in a way it doesn't belong to anyone else in this story. His distance was not accidental, it was engineered. Phoenix was not just a city, it was an architecture. He had built a life specifically dimensioned to keep what he didn't want to face outside the frame of daily consciousness. And what makes this particular psychology so recognizable is how ordinary it is. The absent parent who calls himself busy, who tells himself his parents have it handled, who responds to specific concern with generic reassurance, this is not an outlier. This is a pattern. The turning point that mattered most, not legally, but psychologically, was Zoe's statement in the school counselor's office. Specifically, the detail about the yellow kitchen. Zoe had been holding on to that image, the warm, specific, deliberate warmth of her aunt's kitchen, as a form of hope. She had made it into something to navigate toward. And the fact that an 8-year-old was carrying hope as a private project, kept quietly away from the adults around her because sharing it felt unsafe, is the most complete summary of what the neglect had cost her, not just comfort, but the simple childhood experience of hoping out loud. Nina's delay was not weakness. It was the cost of being embedded in the very system she was trying to evaluate, a cost that every professional who works in human services and carries private family complexity will recognize. The rules of her work were never suspended. She applied them the moment she stopped asking for permission from people with a vested interest in her not applying them. The detail that stays with me longest is the packed backpack by the front door. Not the drawing, not the bruise, not the testimony, that small bag, positioned like a quiet declaration. A child who understood, without being told, that waiting for someone required being ready. And who had been ready, apparently, for 4 days before anyone noticed it sitting there. There's something worth sitting with in that image. How often do the children around us send signals exactly that clear, and how much work do we do, unconsciously, out of loyalty or convenience or simple reluctance, to look at those signals and call them something less than what they are? Zoe wasn't crying. She wasn't acting out. She was packed and waiting by the door. And the adults in that house walked past it every day. She knew someone would come. She was right. That matters more than anything else in this story.